Welcome to session number 80 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. The author whose works we're looking at this time around is Quinn Yarbro. And we're going to be just looking at the first three books, which I have right here in somewhat different formats, of her Saint-Germain cycle, which is quite extensive. So first three of these to keep it fairly manageable. Those are also the first three that came out in ebook format, so they're available to the public. Now, what is Worlds of Speculative Fiction? If you have joined me for some of these other sessions or watched some of the videos, you already know what it is. But for anybody who is just tuning in to this, the Worlds of Speculative Fiction is a series that was originally in person, hosted at the Brookfield Library, started in 2016 when we moved back here to the Milwaukee area as a way for me to do a little guilty pleasure reading and talk about philosophical themes in some classic sci-fi and fantasy literature and world building and some other things as well, and to get to engage with the public who is interested in these sorts of topics. Eventually, during the COVID shutdown, we moved to this online format where, we have videos that premiere and we have live chat on that. The videos run anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes, and then we follow it up immediately with a more intimate session and conversation in Zoom right after the video premiere. Now, if you're seeing this after the premiere, you can, of course, leave comments, and we engage in some discussion that way as well. And people watch this in part because they like the attention to, the author's own thoughts about their work, the world building, culling out important philosophical themes. And it's a way to get introduced to or participate in conversations about authors that are new to you. And some of them are new to me. So Quinn Yarbro is somebody who has been suggested by a, long-time participant in these sessions who, kept on saying, you really need to read this person. You're going to like this. And yes, it turned out that, as usual, she was correct about that. There's been a number of other suggestions. And so, we've got three books here. It all begins with Hotel Transylvania. This is the Milwaukee Library copy, and then we ended up having to purchase, because they weren't available in the library, and I like to have books in my hands, the next two, The Palace and Blood Games. And just to give you a little bit of intro into this, for those who aren't familiar with the series. So Saint-Germain, who we'll talk about in great detail later, is a vampire and has lived many, not just centuries, but millennia. And you could say that chronologically in these three books, Blood Games would be the first one because it's happening in ancient Rome, starting with the time of Nero and ending a few emperors later. But Hotel Transylvania is the kickoff, and that happens in the, you could call it the Age of Enlightenment, but it's really more of an age of decadence in many respects. Pre-revolutionary France. And Saint-Germain is one of the people acting there. And then we jump back to the Renaissance and the time of Florence with the Palace. A few other cities are referenced in there as well. And then we go further back in time. And that's the way the novels actually are. They're all literally all over the map and all over time, depending on where Yarbro wanted to situate this central character who everything else essentially revolves around as far as the story goes. But of course, he is living in different times, spaces, cultures where everything doesn't revolve around him, and he often has to be quite concerned with how things are going to turn out for the eternal foreigner, somebody who's also set apart for other reasons. But that's enough about that. We're going to do some discussion of biography, of world building, what genre this stuff actually it fits into, the character Saint-Germain himself and the semi-historical or quasi-historical personage that it's based on, philosophical themes that are emerging, particularly ethical themes in these stories. And then we'll, hopefully have a conversation about these. And I will say this. So I'm typically, skeptical of any particular author who's got a big following. I'm like, I don't know if they're going to be that good. This is great stuff. And so I really enjoyed getting to read my way through these. I'm looking forward to going further in the series and seeing what goes on. So perhaps we'll do another session about this very series, but going deeper into it next year in Worlds of Speculative Fiction. So that said, let's jump into the main event. Before we get fully underway, we should do a little bit of discussion of the world building in very broad outlines that we find in these three first novels of the Saint-Germain cycle. So it might be helpful to begin with the first novel, although we should point out that chronologically, Blood Games, the third novel, is going to, you could say, narratively antedate these other two. As a matter of fact, with these first three, we're kind of starting at one point and going backwards in time in the history of this Saint-Germain character and the other people that are closely involved with him. So one thing that we can say is, and Chelsea Quinn Yarbro is going to talk about this as we're going to see in some of her interviews and essays, these are all times of transition, of crisis within the societies that we find depicted in them. So Hotel Transylvania, the very first book, is about the time of Louis XV, who's not the last French king, but he's pretty darn close. Things are coming to a head. The French king, it's essentially a monarchy that's aiming at absoluteness, but is going to be falling pretty soon. You've got all these nobles who are kind of doing their own thing, but also involved with the court. You've got the rise of other people, the bourgeoisie, although that's not quite so well depicted in this. And you've got all of the occupations of the idle, noble, rich doing their thing. Some of them are not rich because they've managed to ruin themselves. And against this, we have a backdrop of something else. We can call it cruelty, sadism, whatever you want to picture it as. And we'll come back to that theme in just a moment. But that's the official setting of this. And then we jump backwards in time into the Renaissance with the palace. There is a palace being constructed actually for Saint-Germain, and there's a significant amount of, we could call it space and time within the novel devoted to that. But what's really going on is the rise of a religious leader, and you could even say cult, within the Florence of the time. So we've got this conflict between, a situation in which there's lots of rivalry, not only between the Italian city-states themselves, but within the city. And then we've got, you could call it the Renaissance versus a certain kind of religiosity that tends towards fanaticism. And then jumping backwards, we have blood games, and now we're talking about the Roman imperial era, the end of the original dynasty, the Claudian, dynasty, you could call it, with Nero as being one of the key characters and casting a long shadow even after he's deposed. And then all of these other emperors and their reigns, including Vespasian and his sons who are involved in things. So, each of these is a different historical setting, each of which has been researched, detailed in discussion. Chelsea Quinn Yarbro is quite good in not taking these and just adding, some period costumes and making everybody behave like, Americans set back into Rome or something like that. You really do get a sense that we're living in a different time with each of these works, that they're foreign but also somewhat familiar to us. And probably the more that you have studied history and understand it, less foreign to you and more familiar to you. Some of them, I suppose, for some audiences could be quite a revelation. So I mentioned this term cruelty. And one of the things that we should say about the worlds that are depicted in these is that we have quite powerful characters, and some of them are characters who are good. Some of them, you could say, are characters who are more neutral, more opportunistic, looking out for themselves, and some of them are quite evil. And so, we get a number of these in the Hotel Transylvania, organized essentially around a Satanist cult, right? And what they want to do is actually make sacrifices to Satan, to what they conceive of as Satan, of certain particular women, including one of the really main important characters. And, we have similar motifs coming out, for example, in the Palace and in Blood Games. So in the Palace, we have the agents of Savonarola who want to essentially destroy. They're using it as an opportunity to exert power over people. And there's this distrust of the flesh, but also this desire to dominate, to make other people out to be mere worms and stuff like that, abasement, right? And I think these thematics come out even more in a society like that of Rome in Blood Games, where, you've got to watch out for the ordinary people, the crowd, who are quite fickle, demanding blood. There's a lot of stuff around the gladiatorial games. There's even discussions by the gladiator trainers. They're like, oh, this is just butchery these days. It used to be there was some skill involved. It's kind of declining and just consuming human life. And it's a world in which tragedy occurs. And tragedy not just because people are brought into circumstances where goods conflict with each other. There are people who are genuinely evil, who want to inflict as much harm as possible. And we encounter these characters, fairly early on in every one of the books. Nero himself is somebody like that. But we also have, the master of the bestiary who wants to, do damage and holds grudges and things like that, and loves when he gets a slave who he can torture. There's this Justice who is one of the, Cornelius Justus Silius, who is one of the senators who subjects his wife, his third wife, because he's already had two bad marriages, to very degrading sexual practices, makes her copulate with all sorts of people, basically, so he can get it up and then, have some sort of release himself. And the more degrading, the more debasing, the better. He threatens to ruin her family if she doesn't go along with it. She winds up being isolated from her family as a result. So there's all sorts of vulnerabilities. There's all sorts of bad actors involved with this. And there's all sorts of I didn't know what was going on sort of things, as well as the normal machinations of power, of commerce, of money, of prestige, all the other things that people get themselves worked up about, as well as, for example, patronage of art and architecture or music or learning. And so it's a very rich world in which there's a great deal of good being depicted and promoted, and there's also a great deal of evil and badness. And the evil and badness are not exactly the same thing, we could say. There's also a lot of cases where you would say, oh, well, this bad person is doing these bad things. Won't somebody stop them? And in some cases, the answer is yes. And in other cases, the answer is no. So, for example, in Blood Games, Saint-Germain has three slaves, three servants, who he has brought into the vampire life, right? Shared blood with them and all that. And one is a Persian prince, one is an Armenian charioteer, one is an Egyptian who's been with him a very, very long time. And all three of them are caught up in this sort of dragnet of arresting foreigners and their slaves, worrying about insurrection. And they are condemned to be killed, but, if they were killed in a certain way, being crucified, you could take their bodies, take them back, then they would come back to life. But since they're going to be torn apart by beasts, and that is indeed what happens to them, there is no possibility for them surviving. And likewise, in the very first book, Hotel Transylvania, we find that there is a female character who has a husband who's actually connected with the Satanist cult, and she ends up being offered up to it. They engage in all sorts of torture, some of which is sexual with her, and the aim is to destroy her entirely. And that they succeed in that, essentially. So there are quite a few characters who don't survive, who don't make it through. And, this is part of the world that is being depicted. It's one in which good doesn't always triumph over evil. And, the one thing that you can say if you're a vampire, well, at least the evil people, after a while, they die off. But there isn't any cosmic setting things straight. Even in Blood Games, at the very end, when the most malicious character, Cornelius Justus Silius, gets his comeuppance, is it really a satisfaction? Not exactly. So that is the world that is being depicted. There is one other thing that I do want to say about the building, the revelation of the world. And this has to do more with the format of the stories themselves. So there's, chapters, and they're divided usually into big sections of the work. And each of the chapters tends to be either preceded or concluded, depending on how you look at it, by a letter, usually, sometimes an order, sometimes other things as well. So here's a great example. Text of a letter from Il Conte Giovanni Pico della Mirandola to Marsilio Ficino. Now, if you know your Renaissance philosophy, you know these are important philosophers. To his friend in Fiorenza, Marsilio Pico sends greetings in Plato from Roma. You must be the first to hear of my good news. The Pope has at last granted me an audience for my petition. Who would have thought that Rodrigo Borgia de Lara, of all men, would be willing to hear me? And it goes on, right? There are disquieting rumors in Rome. And all of these letters are giving us insights into the mindsets of characters. Every once in a while, Saint-Germain writes a letter or receives a letter. Most often, these are all the other characters. So it's a way to bring in multiple voices. And by the way, there are quite a few characters. None are in the first person, but they're all being looked at and addressed, you could say, by the narrative voice, the narrative scrutiny that we're getting through this. And so that's a really integral part, I would say, of this world building. Sometimes the letters are, even just, you could say, a little bit of seasoning because they're not exactly about the main action that's being discussed. It's sort of developing an entire world of discourse that allows us, the readers, to penetrate more into the setting that Chelsea Quinn Yarbro has created for us to watch all the action unfold. With an author like Chelsea Quinn Yarbro and Saint-Germain, her character, and the entire series that she has worked out over decades involving him, we're actually quite fortunate in that not only has she given a lot of interviews, some of which we're going to look at later, but she's actually written short essays from time to time in which she reveals to us some of her thought process, what it was that she was intending to do with the series. And so I think it's important that we look at least some of these early on. And the two that I picked as particularly relevant, well, one is called From Dracula to Saint-Germain, and it's based on a talk that she gave in 1997 at Boston College. The other is directly relevant as well. It's called Saint-Germain and the Lives of Women, and it's much later, 2010. So I'm going to read these to you and, imagine them in her voice, and then maybe we'll do a little bit of commentary on parts as needed. So, From Dracula to Saint-Germain begins. In college, I took a class in folklore and myth and found myself renewing my interest in the vampire archetype, first encountered when I read Dracula at age 14. I did a paper on the commonalities and differences in vampire myths worldwide. All vampires take life from their victims, blood being the most common means of accomplishing this, though one Chinese vampire goes in for spinal fluid and Finnick and Eskimo vampires leech body heat. A decade later, I went back to vampire myths and began to make notes on how far from the Dracula model I could go and still have a recognizable vampire. Anything that more than 80% of the cultures believed I took as being true of vampires. Native earth ties, nocturnal activities, lacking a reflection, dying and not staying dead, preying on the living to survive, aversion to sunlight, discomfort, crossing, running, or tidal, all were part of the mix. The heavy-handed propaganda of the Christian faith was set aside as grandstanding, as were all other religious spins attached to the myths, since given the very ancient beginnings of vampires, formal religions were Johnny's-come-lately in any case. So that's the first set of questions. Well, what is a vampire? How can I make them as a character in a story? The second level of questions, she goes on, arose from the relationship of vampires to humans. Must the relationship be exploitative? And must humans abhor vampires? The more I thought about it, the more I thought it was worth trying to use a vampire as a metaphor for humanism. A person living an unnaturally long life might become alienated from humanity as a means of avoiding the pain of spending most of your time saying permanent goodbyes. Or it was just possible the vampire would, though through his very alienation, seek to be part of human experience, which offered a great many more dramatic possibilities. Now, this is a theme that we will take up and explore a bit later. Third, related to this realization came my third concern in dealing with the inherent loneliness of semi-immortality and narrowing my previous assessment. Why must the vampire's partners be victims? Wouldn't it be less hazardous if they were cooperative? So victims were out, bringing me to the most basic issue of all, the whole question of the biting and blood. For me, the most conspicuous thing about the blood is its importance to the living partner as well as to the undead vampire. There is a magical power to blood that is as old as human consciousness. Most obviously, it is essential to human life, the one thing vampires conspicuously lack. Jungian theories seem more applicable than other psychoanalytical approaches, and so I use it as a kind of multicultural filter to work out the knottiest core of the mythic vampire figure. Given the sexual wallop vampires pack, what a great line right there, right? The vampiric experience, no matter how it comes about, is loaded with erotic implications. A bite counts as penetration, doesn't it? Though it might be a bit kinky. Suppose the orgasm is part of the payoff for the vampire as well as the vampire's partner. In its most positive form, sexual intimacy is a mutual comprehension that enhances the lives of the participants, revealing and accepting in its nature, getting to the unique individuality of the persons involved, and what is more uniquely personal than blood. So let's pause there for a moment. So that is definitely something that you see coming out in these novels, right? All of them could be read as, wow, there's a lot of eroticism in here. Why? What is the point of it? And very often it's being contrasted against human beings who are also engaging in erotic behavior, but where it is exploitative, where it isn't intimate, where it is dominating, where it is there to damage, and even in the case of Hotel Transylvania, entirely obliterate the other person. Right? So there's really something deep here, some meditations on human sexuality and eroticism and intimacy woven into this character of the vampire. Going back to the essay, she writes, now that I had hit upon a more positive approach to vampirism and a way of presenting it that was, I hoped, new enough to be interesting, but still recognizable as to type, I had to come up with the character, the setting, and the history. Louis XV's Paris, the setting of the first Saint-Germain novel, Hotel Transylvania, was attractive. It was in a period I knew something about already. It was visually lavish. There was a great deal of interest in occultism at the time. The society was highly mannered. There was a tolerance of foreigners that made it possible to let this vampire move about in society. Women were an active and visible part of society with a relative amount of autonomy, and it was a society trembling, all unaware, on the brink of collapse. Wonderful stuff for novels. So she goes on and says, I also looked about for historical people to lend more authenticity to the story. The more research I did, the more obvious it became to me that the real Le Comte de Saint-Germain was the very hero I was looking for. He dressed in black and white. I added the ruby stick pin. He never ate or drank in public. He was a known occultist and alchemist. He claimed to be 4,000 years old and to drink the elixir of life. He had more than a dozen identified aliases. He was cultured, talented, intelligent, multilingual, elegant, and humanistic. He was a foreigner whose true national origins were never discovered. He was rich. He was also irresistible. So was his manservant, Robert, who claimed to have served Saint-Germain since Vespasian was Caesar. In a very real sense, the literary Saint-Germain possesses all the raw material that Dracula does, but his experience of vampirism is vitally different. Unlike Dracula, Saint-Germain does not get off on taunting his hunters. Unlike Dracula, Saint-Germain treasures the brevity of human life rather than holding it in contempt. And unlike Dracula, Saint-Germain offers liberation to his partners instead of demanding the capitulation of his prey. So, That's quite interesting. She concludes by saying, 3 publishers, 9 editors, and approximately 2 million words later, Saint-Germain has not even begun to exhaust his possibilities for me. Right? So what an essay, really revealing a lot there. Now let's look at Saint-Germain and the lives of women, where we're focusing in on a really central motif. Again, totally there in all 3 of these books. We're going to talk a little bit about the heroines, we could say, / victims involved in these, because they are central to the plot as well. So, Saint-Germain and the Lives of Women from 2010. When I began work on the Saint-Germain cycle almost 4 decades ago, I had 3 thematic goals in mind. First, to push the vampire archetype as far to the positive as possible and still retain characteristics of the archetype. Second, to give the reader some idea of what it was like to live in the time of the story. Third, to put emphasis on the lives of women. Of all 3 goals, the third turned out to be the most difficult. Why? The problem is that almost all history is written by men about men. Women, even when they were allowed to be literate, did not reveal much of how they lived, and researching certain periods in history have proven to be much more difficult in this regard than I had anticipated. One of the things that became apparent was, generally speaking, the lives of women from the highest social stratum to the lowest had much more commonality than the lives of men, since most of the time women had limited legal rights and often forbade the control of their money and property, restricted educational opportunities, and imposed draconic penalties for any perceived or actual transgressions. One of the difficulties in choosing periods for history, for stories to occur, has to do with the position of foreigners, and Saint-Germain is nothing if not a foreigner, in society, and access to women. Better in the Dark deals with one of the most onerous times for the oppression of women. While I was researching the period, I came across a book on laws and their enforcement in northern Germany at the time, and the thing that most appalled me was that if a married woman had intercourse with any man but her husband, he was expected to kill her and any of her children. This applied even in cases of rape. That told me much more than I wanted to know about women in the mid-10th century, but it gave me a powerful sense of the society in which the women lived. Most of the women in Saint-Germain's life are in one way or another on the fringes of their societies, even women in positions of privilege. Others are virtual outcasts. A small number are substitute males. Some are being manipulated by controlling males. A few, like Madeleine de Montalia and Rowena Saxon, appear in multiple books, and in Madeleine's cases have books of their own. The other spin-off books are about Atala Olivia Clemens, who appears in Blood Games. And then she says, I want to say something about Olivia, by the way. Olivia provides the female experience more directly than Saint-Germain does. In the 3 books about her, A Flame in Byzantium, Crusader's Torch, and Candles for D'Artagnan, Olivia, an imperial Roman matron, sees her position and autonomy erode steadily, and since she's an intelligent and capable woman, this pisses her off. Her frustration with the imposition society made on women after the Roman Empire fell to the various barbarians and the Christians inform her 3 novels. Being seriously long-lived, Olivia knows from experience what she has lost, and is not much inclined to be philosophical about it. Unlike Madeleine, who sees the opportunities for female scholars gradually improve, Olivia had to deal with circumstances growing steadily worse. For Olivia, Saint-Germain is one person who understands her sense of being thwarted by social conventions and who grasps her ongoing disappointment. She goes on and talks about professions available to women, and I'm going to skip over that part, but she does say something really interesting. She talks about the emergence of a genuine middle class, and then she says these kinds of tipping points in society are often the most fertile ground for Saint-Germain stories to sprout in. Societies in flux usually have periods, however brief, of legal and occupational fluidity, and that tends to be what I look for in terms of environments and settings for Saint-Germain, in large part because the most stringent restrictions on women tend to relax a little during such transitional periods, and the position of foreigners tend to be less prescribed than when society follows established norms. One of the reasons Saint-Germain novels do not often deal with the cultures of the Middle East is because of the extreme sequestration of women, which tends to limit the erotic possibilities for Saint-Germain. It would also expose any woman involved with him to the possibility of extreme consequences for her association with him, which he would not find acceptable. She finishes by saying, "When I started out with the cycle, finding reliable information on women's lives was more difficult than it is now. Luckily, I lived near the University of California, Berkeley's campus, and therefore had a large supply of graduate students to take to lunch to pick their brains, a practice I continue to this day." A sort of collegiality there. "As a result, I can cross-check the published information on a vast variety of subjects and periods and find out the most current information available. Also, I have the chances to hear the latest debates and theories, especially in regard to the lives of women, which often results in richer historical textures to Saint-Germain's adventures." So in both of these essays, we get, very thoughtful and clear expositions of what it is that Chelsea Quinn Yarbro is doing in these books. What is her motivation for writing them and centering them around Saint-Germain? And it turns out that being able to discuss what happens with these, very interesting female characters is one of the key motifs to the entire set of works. Before we go on to look at what Chelsea Quinn Yarbro has said about her work in response to others in interviews, and before we look at some of the other philosophical themes and plot points of these novels, we should take a little while to delve into them. Who is this Saint-Germain character, at least as he's revealed in these first several novels? So the first chapter of the first novel begins, "He was known as Le Comte de Saint-Germain, though he had had other names, but few in Paris would have recognized even the most illustrious of those names, for the glamorous court of Louis XV cared little for what had happened beyond French borders or before the Sun King had reigned." And a little bit later, we're going to, read that he's identified as Prince Ragosi of Transylvania, and he says, "Yes, I have that honor." He reflected that name was as much his as Saint-Germain was, or Belletti had been. He had used Ragosi for many years in Italy, Hungary, Bohemia, Austria, and the German city of Dresden. So he's already a character with many names. And, if you want to go and look up who the historical person who identified himself as Saint-Germain was, you can certainly do that. What we're interested in here is particularly the depiction that we're getting from Yarbro. So a bit later on, we get this interesting discussion that is going on between him and Madeleine, who is eventually going to become a vampire like him and will actually become a character of her own in later novels. So what we hear her, talking about is the Saint Sebastian set, which have terrible, things in mind for her, and they've already done some pretty horrific stuff. And he talks about the power that people call Satan, and he gives us a little bit of insight into his own point of view about things. He says, "There is a power which is only that. It is like the rivers which nurture us and can destroy us, whether we are prosperous or drowned in floodwaters. The rivers are still the same. So with this power and when it lifts us up and opens our eyes to goodness and wonders, so that we're ennobled and inspired to kindness and excellence, we call it God. But when it is used for pain and suffering and degradation, we call it Satan. The power is both. It is our use alone which makes it one or the other." And she says, "That is heresy." And he says, "It is the truth. Grant me then, for the sake of argument, there are those who use the power of Satan and they create much sorrow. And she says, then they will spend eternity in hell. And he says, you know nothing of eternity. He says this sharply, but the compassion in his dark eyes took the sting from his words. So he's setting the scene for what's about to be happening and the conflict that is going to ensue. And then they end up talking a bit more, and she says, well, why do you care about me? And he says, your life is so sweet and so dreadfully short, I do not think I could bear to lose 1 hour of it to them. And, she says, Saint-Germain, and he laughs gently, resumes leaning on the table, self-mockery twisting his mouth into a painful smile. And he says, no, you need not fear me. You will take no harm from me. I find no joy in assault and its fear. I have not forced myself on a woman for more than 500 years, and certainly not in the sense you mean. So he's not, going to be a threat. And she says, 500 years, how old are you? And here's where we get, some of the backstory. I don't remember, he said, turning away. I was old when Caesar ruled in Rome. I heard Aristotle teach. Akhenaten praised the likeness of the bust I commissioned of his beloved Nefertiti in Amarna. No one has found its ruins yet, but I have walked there when the city was new. You have never died? She felt her hands grow cold as she asked. I think that perhaps I did die once long ago. I don't remember. Certainly, I have seen enough of death to know how fragile and precious life is. And she asks him, are you so unhappy? And he says, well, actually, I'll back this up a little bit. He says, don't pity me. I've had more than my fair share of death. I think I've been mad at times, then I bathed in blood. I sought out wars and cruelty. I remember the circus in Rome, and I disgust myself. More recently, when I returned to my homeland, I used patriotism as an excuse to take lives and revel in it. And he says, so the reverence I have now for you and your brief life is dearly bought. He's a conflicted but character, but one who's learned through bitter experience. So she says, are you so unhappy? And he says, I drink the elixir of life, and I do not die. I cannot die. So, he is somebody who is, stuck in eternity, unless he experiences what they call the true death. Then there's another interesting feature here, too. He says, when I was young, I was considered a tall man. Now, I'm less than average. 400 or 500 years from now, and I will be thought a dwarf. Right? So human beings are changing, but he can't change in his body, so to speak. Much later in the book, when he is now involved with Madeline in a romantic, erotic way that is, we're going to be likened to a sacrament. They have another conversation. And they're on consecrated ground. She's escaped Saint Sebastian and his minions. And he says, Saint Sebastian will not come onto consecrated ground. And she says, well, if you're here, this cannot be consecrated ground. And he says, well, your nuns don't know everything. All of my kind can walk on consecrated ground. Most of us are buried in it. He felt her stiffen in his embrace. There, I have said it and you are horrified. It is not safe to have much light in here, he says. And then they go on a little bit further, and she says, you walk on consecrated ground. You're not damned if you do this. And he says, well, not in the usual way. And she says, communion is partaking of the body and blood of Christ, is it not? And he says, well, you know that better than I. So she says, if blood is a sacrament, then what we have done is a sacrament too. She was near him, and her eyes yearned for him. Oh God, he said softly in his private torment, you are willing, but you do not know what may happen to you. Can't you see that my very desire makes me dangerous to you? I burn for you, but I cannot. Right? And she says, if you're not by me, I will die, and it will be a death that lasts until the last trumpet. You would not do that to me. And he says, no. And as it's going to turn out, he is going to turn her, and he turns her through not just love, attraction, but also the things that they do together, which involve pleasure and the sharing of blood. A little bit later in this book as well, he is talking to Madeline again, and he says, it's a common belief one born at the winter solstice will be a vampire. If that's so, it certainly puts a new light on the resurrection, and in memory of him, blood is drunk, is it not? The words were flippant, but his tone was not. Oh, I know, my kind should fear the cross and cringe at the mention of God, if you believe the folk tales. But just as many of us lie in consecrated ground, so we lie under crosses and in churches before altars, yet we walk. It is not the sacred signs that stop us, Madeline. I can hold a crucifix in my hand and suffer no torment with it, but you would find it otherwise with those who worship the devil, the power used for evil and destruction. It is they, not I, who cannot endure the cross. It is they, not I, who are not able to touch the symbols of power as God. And so, this is quite an important point of view. There is evil and good, and there is, God and the devil, you could say, in the world as this power. Saint-Germain is something independent of those. He also lets us in on a little bit. He says, I cannot cross running water, but I learned long, long ago to fill my soles and heels with my native earth. As long as I am shod, I need not fear sunlight or running water. And so, this is, you could say, tricks of the trade for the vampires of these stories. They have to have ways to get through things. So Saint-Germain needs earth from Dacia, right? Some of the other characters are going to need earth from their native land as well. Olivia from Rome, Demetria from Florence, and Madeline from France, as we're going to find later on. Now, turning to the next story, the palace, we get a few other important passages to look at, one of which is actually a text of a letter to Francesco Ragosi de San Germano from a Roman woman writing in colloquial Latin and signing herself Olivia. Main character, one of the characters of Blood Games, which is written later. And she says, I've heard from our friend Nicholas that you've settled temporarily by the Arno and for the time being have given up your house in Venezia. Undoubtedly, you know what you're doing, but you might consider coming to Roma instead of staying in Fiorenza. For say what you like about the place, it's still just a Roman camp trying to be a city. You needn't remind me of the artists and poets and musicians there, for Medici is forever sending one or more of them to the Pope, his family, courtesy. And then she goes on and talks about the changes in Rome. And she says, do you remember that first time you came to me? How frightened I was of you then. You wanted to give terror, but instead you gave passion. And it was a little later that you said you no longer wanted to survive on fear. You felt that fulfilled desire gave you a satisfaction you'd not known before. I can still see your face full of loneliness and anguish. And are you, I wonder, as much alone now as you were then? Don't torment yourself, Saint-Germain Franciscus, as you taught me yourself. There is delight in this world, and until you die the true death, life will call to you, and you must answer. There, I have lapsed into philosophy. I must be getting old. Now, how old is she at this time? More than 1,000 years, right? The reason for my letter is not to share reminiscences, but to warn you of the latest developments in Roma. And she goes on. And then she says, you know, I've often thought our condition is unfair to the men of our numbers. We women still have sexual congress as well as the pleasures of our kind, but you men lose the means of that usual satisfaction. Is the joy you have enough, I wonder, or do you miss the other? Once again, I'm becoming philosophical. And that's a topic that we'll discuss when we turn explicitly to sexuality in these novels a little bit later. But it's interesting to see Olivia, this character, getting to speak before we get her revealed in this. A little bit later, the main character who is going to become the object of Saint-Germain's affections and become a vampire is Demetrique, and she is a woman who is a scholar. She learns some alchemy from him as well. She's going to wind up being imprisoned, as we're going to talk about later. And they are talking to each other, and he says, I've watched you many times. And then we have this interesting scene. So why was it always so difficult, Ragosi wondered. Was it that he hated to be feared? Was it that admitting the truth would set the final seal on his loneliness? And he says, what did Lorenzo tell you? He said you were more than an alchemist. He said that you were immortal. Not immortal, not quite. The words were quick, harsh. He said that you are a vampire. When he gave her no answer, she went on recklessly. He said that the church was wrong and your kind are not demons or cursed of God, that you are not like Satan. He said that you are something else entirely. He was right, Ragosi said softly. He stood still a moment and listened to the rain. Demetrice, I told you before, and I'll tell you that now that you stand in no danger from me, no danger whatever. No one and nothing in Fiorenza is endangered by me, or if there is harm, that is not my intention. Before she could stop herself, she said, but I saw blood. I had it from one who was willing to give it beyond the Porta San Frediano. Not Donna Anastasia then? No, Anastasia is a person who's going to become totally deranged, as we'll see later. So this is, quite important. And she says, well, what happens when you drink? He desperately wanted the conversation to end. Most of the time, very little. There is a pleasant dream, a sweet satisfaction, and in the morning some lassitude because a little blood is gone. No, amica mia, I'm not the ravenous thing you think me. You could fill the ruby cup I gave Lorenzo with what I take from the living, but the blood is not enough. It will keep me alive, but it is not enough. So when it is possible, I have intimacy as well. It is not only the blood that nourishes me, it is nearness, pleasure, all intense emotions. Only those who come to me knowingly are tainted by me. Only those who accept me as I am will be like me. And she asked, well, why didn't you save your friend Lorenzo? I mean, if you're a vampire and you can give people eternal life, and Saint-Germain says, I couldn't. Why not? I couldn't save him. And every day he suffered, I searched, I hoped for a way, but it was blood, his blood. To be changed, the blood must be clean. His blood was so diseased that it killed him. There was nothing I could do for him, as we'll see him doing for others within these stories. One other passage from this as well. So this is when Demetrice has been put to some torture, and she says, Fiorenza is where I live. I would die away from it. And he says, I understand more than you know. And she says, you're very old, aren't you? It must seem foolish to love this city or to want to stay here. And he says, do you know what's in these boots? She says, no. And he says, earth, my native soil. Without it, I would be unable to cross running water or walk in the sunlight for fear of being burned as you would be by hot metal. Don't tell me about the pull of home. I know it. I've known it for more than 3,000 years in lands you know nothing of. The earth is my life as much as blood is. Right? So this is quite important. And then they go on and talk a little bit more, and he talks about the representation of vampires. If they're willing to believe I'm diabolic, that I desecrate altars, that I cause demons to attack women, they may never discover what I truly am. A sacrilegious ravisher is a bogey to frighten children and give adults a few moments of titillation. But a vampire is a dangerous, hideous, voracious thing that will kill them all in their beds. right? And of course, this is not what vampires are at all. Now, jumping back further in time to Blood Games, jumping back more than 1,000 years and advancing the narrative, we find out more about vampires and about this, character, Saint-Germain, but we're finding out about an earlier version of him. So we have this interesting engagement with Olivia, who Saint-Germain is in love with. She falls in love with him as well. And he says, I want you, Olivia. You know how I want you. Her answer was a tightening of her arms. There were no words for her to tell him, but they were not necessary. And then she says, it was joyous to give her will, which had sustained her through all the torment justice had forced on her, over to an even stronger will that was set on seeing her fulfilled. Now, isn't that interesting? A will not to dominate, but to fulfill. In the past, when Saint-Germain had experienced such merging of desire, it had been cloaked in the compelling bonds of religion. Now, not religion like we've seen here with the Catholic Church, but religion of earlier times and cultures. This had all that convergence of purpose, but now it was done for its own sake. Everywhere he touched Olivia, he could feel the passion of her in his hands. Her demand increased with his, and she strained to draw him nearer. Saint-Germain moved eagerly over her body, riding the inexorable tide of her longing. He received her with elation, sharing her release. Only much later did his doubts return. He lay looking up at the bed hangings. Olivia slept with her arm across his chest, her head in the curve of his neck. Was Amenhotep right after all? Had he been right all along? Why did she and her uncertain smile penetrate his long-established defenses so effortlessly? If her life had been otherwise, if she'd married an honorable man, she would have found this affair repugnant, but she doesn't. And, she asks, is anything wrong? And he says, no, nothing's wrong. And she says, I know you're concerned. It's about what you do to me. I don't mind, truly. And he says, it's not that, not entirely. Most people, when I have come to them, have regarded me with awe and fear. Both emotions have their uses. A few others accept my ways because there are advantages in compliance. Right? And he says, I have been willing to make do with adoration or terror or concession. Now I don't know. I don't know. There's something more that he wants. And he says, for whatever forlorn reason you've accepted me, I am grateful. I give you my word. I will not desert you. I will not repudiate this union. And she says, and is this all our union? She had not wanted her ravishers to touch her, something we'll talk about again later. But Saint-Germain she welcomed, now notice this, with her whole being. So a very important response. Later on in the same book, we have Amenhotep talking to him. And, he's been with Saint-Germain for a very long time. And he's saying, you need to be careful with this. And he says, she's not safe to know. And Saint-Germain says, yet it was you who told me that I was becoming too remote, too untouchable. You see, I've taken your advice. Now you warn me of the very thing you urged. How can I deal with all your strictures? He was teasing, an ironic note to his voice. Amenhotep responded seriously, I don't question your need for her. You are changed since you've known her, and it is good to have it so. She has awakened something in you. I have no words for it, my master. You are like one recovering from a long illness who rediscovers the world and life. Yet this carrying has become a grave risk for you, for her, perhaps for all of us. So, it's not just the solitary vampire. He exists with others of his kind who are part of his household, and he has to think of everybody else. We see him confronting this Persian spy as well, who wants him to turn over Khosrad Kalvan to them and allow him to be executed, not knowing that Saint-Germain has actually already turned him, after a terrible chariot crash, into a vampire. And so what do we find out there? There's a bit more of the backstory revealed. So he says, "What else did you learn in Egypt?" He kept the tone gently mocking, but his mind was wholly alert. Lead Ashrenur might prove to be more of a threat than he'd seemed at first. There was an old man, Ashrenur explained. He sold herbs and spices and had the reputation for being skilled in medicine. There were those who called him a priest. His name was Senistus. Was? Saint-Germain asked in spite of himself. He had an instant of vivid memory of the tall, dignified Senistus in his white robes and pectoral. Ashrenur shrugged. He was not very strong, and toward the end his mind wandered. He thought he was back in the temple of Imhotep. He spoke a great deal of his predecessor. It was a curious tale. Perhaps you'd like to hear it. How much had Senistus revealed before he died? Saint-Germain asked himself. The old priest had full knowledge of him, but would have resisted telling what he knew. He could see the gloating curve of Led Ashrenur's full mouth and wished that he had the opportunity to peel the flesh from bone and teeth. His anger was hazardous, and he kept it banked within himself. I am often entertained by curious stories. This former high priest of Imhotep, according to old Senistus, was a foreigner. That itself was unusual, but apparently this man was more remarkable. He had many strange habits, including that he neither ate nor drank except in private, and then he claimed only of the elixir of life. He was attributed with miracles. It was said that his body slave had been brought to him, a dead man, the victim of plague, a novice from the temple of Thoth, and that after 2 days life returned to him. Another drinker of the elixir of life, no doubt, Saint-Germain said with feigned boredom. If Senistus had been brought to speak of Amenhotep, he had revealed more than Saint-Germain had thought. Not according to Senistus. He said the slave was not like his master, but what the difference was, he would not reveal. You have a body slave who is an Egyptian, or so I have heard. And then he says, the old man died before he told us more. And so, he asks, how old are you, Franciscus, if that's your name? Older than you think me, was his grave answer. And Ragosi Saint-Germain Franciscus is as much my name as any that Senistus that knew. And he says, I'm surprised, spy, that knowing what you do, you have attempted anything so rash as this interview. Right? So that's a pretty interesting revelation. And then finally, one other that we want to bring up. And this is towards the end of Blood Games. And he's talking to Olivia, and he says that, you need to get ready to go underground, so to speak. And she says, don't talk like that. If I must know these things, I will ask you then. He says, I may not be with you. Olivia, this grows difficult. I have no wish to hurt you, but you must hear these things from me and forget your pain. Truly you must. Otherwise I will have failed you more terribly than I failed Khazarad and Tishtri and Amenhotep. She says, I'll listen. So he says, when you come into my life, you will be tempted to set aside your humanity. It's easy to do this. I did it for a time. That's an emptiness that leads nowhere but to the true death. Loneliness is better than abuse. You must know that, my Olivia. It is never easy to resist the seductive lure of cynicism, but cynicism is its own little death. Guard yourself against it. Our kind cannot afford to be uncompassionate. You will find it a formidable task of times when the ignorant and zealous despise you and those you care for shrink from you. It will happen, Olivia. When it does, try not to feel contumely. Intimacy like ours is frightening to those who've never known it. Olivia, he said in another deeper tone, I had meant to be here with you when you woke, but it may not be possible if I am not there. Remember there is no shame in your desires, and remember that the blood is so much chaff if there is nothing more than blood. And she says, the only lover I want is you. And he says, well, you will want others. It is our nature. And she says, but now, don't you want this? And he says, infinitely. I have had no nourishment since our last night in the garden. I want that strength from you, I admit, but more, I want your love. And she says, love me then, and that's sort of where they're going to leave off. Olivia will go on with her own history, coinciding with his. And what we see here is a depiction of what a positive vampire could actually be like, stripping away the silly, nonsense that other people are bringing up and acknowledging the bits and pieces that are true. But notice as well that we have sort of a profound meditation on, well, how would you actually make it through a life like that with eternity potentially ahead of you? It's only going to be possible with not detachment, but involvement with other human beings, and that is what Saint-Germain, at certain points in his time, certainly in the ones depicted in these novels, in fact does. Earlier on, I promised that we would go through at least some of the many interviews that Chelsea Quinn Yarbro has given in her many years of writing. Now it's time to deliver. There's a number of different topics that we want to look at that she has something to say about, ranging from how she does historical research or how things other than writing inform her work to, of course, Saint-Germain as a character, the change in the vampire motif in her work, what she does to situate herself within genres like horror. And we can also talk a little bit about something we touched on earlier, Saint-Germain and women. So let's start by looking at Saint-Germain as a character itself. SFF world, sci-fi and fantasy world says the first book in the Saint-Germain series was published in 1978. How did you manage to keep track of everything over such a long time span? If you had the chance, is there anything you'd want to go back and change? And so Yarbro says, early on in the series, I made a chronology for the events in Saint-Germain's life, not only in the books already written, but references to characters and events that had not yet been explored. So a kind of, timeline. When I started, it was 4 pages long. Now it's more than 20. I update it with every book and story. Otherwise, I'd be confused and bewildered. I really don't think I want to change anything due to the ripple in the pond effect. If I shift story elements in, say, Blood Games, they could have unexpected ramifications in all the stories and novels that come afterward, good or bad or indifferent. I trust them the way they are. So this is kind of a funny remark, isn't it? These are historical horror, not alternate history, but she's saying, if I went in and edited, now I'd be generating alternate history, perhaps. So that's an interesting idea. In her essay, researching Saint-Germain, she says, with a long-time ongoing series like this, I'm constrained by what I have said in previous books. Many of the readers keep careful track of Saint-Germain's history, so the readers are keeping her honest with this. For the last quarter century, the Saint-Germain cycle has bounced around through 3,500 years of history, and in those adventures it's made references to other events that limit and shape what I can do with the character and when I can do it. And there's, a few other additional requirements. She talks about the society needs to be open enough. We've already talked about that. Then in Strange Horizons interview, she's asked, Saint-Germain is thousands of years old. What do you feel adds to or changes writing about a relationship between characters with that much disparity in age? So Saint-Germain and the people that he works with, his lovers, all these others. So she says he's a little over 4,000 years old, Proto-Etruscan, born to a warlord in what is now Transylvania. He's been rattling around in my head since about 1911, and I've learned to go where he goes, as I've mentioned already. The age disparity becomes an issue in these stories when it is significant to his partner, but less so when the partner isn't bothered by it or has other concerns that supersede the age matter, which is most of them. For example, in Hotel Transylvania, not getting tortured and killed by the main big baddie guy. In the palace, again, not getting tortured and killed by Savonarola and all of his people. And you can say the same thing for Olivia, not being horribly abused by her husband, subjected to sexual exploitation and rapes, and then having her family killed off by that guy. You know, she's not worried about how old Saint-Germain is going to be. So let's shift now into looking at horror as genre. So Chelsea Quinn Yarbro winds up becoming a very important person in these circles. And so the Monster Librarian interview says, many writers are reluctant to let the term horror be attached to them or their work, even when they use classic horror tools such as vampires. You, on the other hand, were the first female president of the Horror Writers Association, one of only 2 female World Horror Convention Grand Masters, and appear not to be not only be okay with the term, but to embrace it. Why do you take this different stance? So she says, I think of myself as a multi-genre writer. Sometimes what I write sells in the horror market, sometimes in the young adult, sometimes in science fiction, sometimes in mystery, etc., etc. Given the reality of genre-defined publishing, I would be professionally remiss to ignore where my work sells and who reads it. For the last decade, more than half of my work is sold in the horror marketplace. It's very flattering that the readers think enough of my work to recognize it as well. As to the horror writers of America, the late Charles Grant asked me if I'd take the organization on. And since I've long been in favor of such organizations, I did, not because I'm female, but because I come from a family of unionists. Sage and Savant asks, what initially interested you in horror, and how have you seen the genre evolve over your 40-year writing career? So Chelsea Quinn Yarbro says, as far back as I can remember, I've liked scary stories. My Finnish grandfather used to tell me folk tales, most of which can be found in the Kalevala, and when I was very young, many of them kind of stuck to me. I'd encountered the Brothers Grimm when I was about 7 and Shakespeare when I was 6. So the die was cast. Notice, Shakespeare counts towards horror. One of the things that truly changed all publishing in general is the merging of publishing companies under fewer and fewer umbrellas. And with all due respect to Roger Corman and Hammer Studios, the standard for horror on film has undergone a truly astonishing revolution, which has tended to push the publishing view of the genre into a more favorable light. Now, the revolution she was talking about, 70s, and then we get better and better horror stuff. But it has also more rigorously genreified the various subgenres of horror, which writers are often actively urged to emulate. And then she says, listen, folks, all writers, no matter what he or she writes, is a subgenre of one. Any other applied genreification is an exterior label and a marketing device that tends to limit what a writer can produce if that's how a writer earns a living. It's ultimately stifling, no matter what the genre may be, which is why I write in many genres and will continue to do so. More of my work is likely to be classified as horror because I like horror stories. I also like science fiction, fantasy, Western, mystery, and historical stories. Now, moving on to the vampire as character, she says a number of different things in different interviews. So, science fiction and fantasy world, you wrote about vampires long before the wave of Twilight and True Blood started. It's kind of funny to think about this because that is already kind of dated, right? Isn't it? Those have been off for quite a long time. Actually, your Saint-Germain series is now the longest vampire series ever. Do you feel like a pioneer? And she says, well, I don't know whether I do or not. I do know I started out intending to push the vampire archetype as far to the positive as possible and still have a recognizable vampire, as we saw her talking about in her essays. Then I used that form of the vampire to write about the lives of women in various times in history and in various cultures. She's asked, why the fascination with vampires? And she says, well, blame Stoker on the one hand and a semester of teaching Unitarian Sunday school to third graders. The kids all seem to like vampires, and I, who like them too, wanted to work with that idea. I tried to write Dracula-style vamps in my teenage years and couldn't get the hang of it. But watching some of the boys doing their best with capes and baring teeth, I found another perspective on the archetype. Strange Horizons asks, with the character of Saint-Germain, who first appears in Hotel Transylvania, and in over 20 volumes since, you've been credited as having originated the vampire as romantic hero. How do you reflect on that aspect of the genre as it's changed in your time? Are you impressed by any of your literary descendants? So the first thing she says is, I don't think of him as a romantic hero. I think of him as a way to look at the lives of women in other periods and cultures, the ultimate outsider by virtue of his nature and his longevity, who can see women's lives the way their contemporaries and sometimes the women themselves cannot. And then she says, because I don't read in the genre in which I'm writing at any given time, I'm perpetually behind on what's out there. Just now I'm not reading mysteries or ghost stories, and for that matter, vampire stories, and so most of my sense of the genre is out of sync with most readers. Am I impressed by what appears to be Saint-Germain's legacy? Well, that's a long and complicated question, and whatever answer I might provide you would be incomplete. Check with me in a decade, and if I'm still here, I may have an answer for you. Open Book Society interview pursues a similar line of questioning. What do you think about the changes of vampires in fiction? Were you expecting this since you created the first, in quotes, nice vampire? And she says, well, fiction genres are constantly mutating, so that it happens to vampire stories isn't surprising. Incidentally, I wasn't one of the first. I was the first in creating a workable, positive vampire. And notice that she's using this term positive rather than nice, romantic, or anything like that. She goes on and says, that isn't my opinion, and it wasn't my intention to create a trend, but academics who specialize in horror literature assure me that this is the case. Finally, Monster Librarian says, it seems that lately the monsters of fiction are changing. You're credited with taking vampires out of their creeping undead dark ages and giving them humanity. Now it seems that vampires are becoming a symbol of our hidden power fantasies, and werewolves are often little more than classic alpha male archetypes. What do you think of this progression? And we might be thinking about, Underworld and stuff like that. And so she says archetypes tend to modify over time, and every writer has his or her own take on how these modifications behave. I'm somewhat put off by stories that reflect little or no sensitivity to folklore or the psychology underlying folklore, and uses media images and tropes instead of folkloric ones to create their archetypal figures, but that's a matter of taste, not of approval or disapproval. This is a motif, by the way, let's call them television and movie tropes, that's going to come up again later in some of the other interviews. Turning to the topic of Saint-Germain and women, which we looked at in an essay earlier, Sage Ann Savant says, vampire stories are predominantly male-centered. How do you approach writing about Count Saint-Germain? And do you think being a woman gives you a unique perspective on the genre? So Chelsea Quinn Yarbro says, I like exploring cultural archetypes and coming at them from non-standard points of view, and have done so since I wrote my first story when I was 6. Saint-Germain began as an experiment. Was it possible to write about a humane vampire, retaining most of the folkloric trappings and make it believable? I also wanted to write about the lives of women in history through the eyes of a compassionate male figure who had a long perspective on history. So in a way, she's not saying this, but Saint-Germain is providing her not with a mouthpiece, not with a lens, but somebody who she can use to say things about women from a very, thoughtful, compassionate, intelligent, well-informed point of view. So she goes on and she says, the books demand a lot of research, but, I like research, so that's not a problem. So far, the blend of historically accurate feminist history and revisionist vampires seems to be working. The odd thing about the series is that most of the editors who worked on the Olivia books disliked her because she, quote, complained too much, which struck me that they were missing the point. If you had been born middle class or upper class female in first century Rome and had the right to own property, would will your property as you wished, had the right to demand and get a divorce, all these sorts of things, you might complain too. Right? So then in open book society, they ask, Saint-Germain seems very aware and supportive of equal rights, even when it stands in contrast to the time period. Was that a conscious decision on your part? How important is that to the story? So she says, I'm a feminist, and I tend to think of these books as being about the lives of women in history as much as they're about my fictional vampire. I also think that someone whose survival depends on achieving intimacy with his or her sexual partner will soon become sensitized to the lives of those partners and will see their experiences from their point of view. I think that thematically, this is crucial to the series. So there's a very interesting, she identifies as a feminist, but the feminism is going to come through, learning, through experience, through intimacy, and that will produce the sort of, better point of view, better perspective that we see Saint-Germain embodying. Now, she mentioned historical research, so let's look at what she has to say about that. In the Open Book Society interview, she's asked, you do a lot of research for each book. About how long does that part of the process take for each book? And she says, well, it depends. The book, what kind of materials are available for research. The longest I've ever taken to research a Saint-Germain was 8 months. Mind you, I wrote 2 other novels during that time for the ancient Egyptian sections of Out of the House of Life. Sci-Fi and Fantasy World says, how much of your inspiration do you draw from real history? And she says, well, it depends on the book or the story. You notice that there's no stock answers. She says, a great deal of my work is solidly based in real history, but I also do like alternate histories. The Saint-Germain books are rigorously accurate about history, so she says. Monster Librarian interview. Writing historical stories certainly presents a challenge. Do you aim more for accuracy or to capture the soul of the era? And she says, now I'm going to paraphrase here. Buddy, that's a false dilemma right there. She says, accuracy is essential to capturing the soul of an era. Fiddle with accuracy and you mess with the soul. I'm trying to give some sense of what it was like to live in a time, what people living in the time actually experienced, and how they saw themselves. I've said many times that one of the hardest things to find out about any society is not what it did. We know what it did, but what it thought it was doing. So this is the realm of intentionality. This is where it takes real imaginative work and real research work. Coming back to that essay, Researching Saint-Germain, she says the hardest thing in writing historical fiction is not to convey what the people did. That's the easy, obvious part, but what they thought they were doing. Now, she said that already in that interview. Here she expands. What did they intend to accomplish? What did they suppose they could achieve those ends through their actions? The answer to those basic questions shape all my historical horror fiction, including this novel. That's where the real marrow lies, the living part of the bone. Isn't that an interesting thing of her to say? So not only, as we just saw a bit, you don't get the soul of the time without the accuracy, but it involves entering into people's mindsets, trying to figure out why do they do the things that they do? What are they trying to accomplish? And this includes not just their good ideas, but also their bad ideas, their bad motives, right? Monster Librarian interview, we come back to that. She's asked, of the many time periods you've written, have any of them presented more of a challenge than others? And so she says, yeah, the less literacy in the period and society, the harder it is to research since the material is scant and the information often of questionable accuracy. Think of the material left in Europe after the barbarian invasions. The records from the period tend to be highly biased towards the European Christian point of view. Not that I think that the barbarians were noble savages and misunderstood, but to refer back to what I mentioned in the previous responses, I'd like to know what they thought they were doing from their points of view. And then she says the two hardest things to find out about any culture is what they wore when they were schlepping around the house and what they ate for breakfast. The sage and savant says, well, we love history, and you include a lot of history in your fiction. What's your process for integrating history into your stories? So she says, integrating actual events with a fictional narrative line is not always easy, particularly when writing about women, since most of history is just that, history, and means occasionally triangulating information from various sources in the hopes of filling in the blanks. I have a lot of reference books about all manner of domestic and social history and consult them regularly. One of my favorite sources is a marvelous book on the history of weather and climate from 1000 BC to 1985 AD, which is invaluable to me, and another one on the history of food for the last 2,000 years. I have 4 historical atlases and a number of various compilations of events and developments throughout the world arranged in chronological order by general topic. The important thing to me is to take a period, whatever period it is, as much on its own terms as possible. That's occasionally difficult or disquieting to do, but if the story requires it, in my opinion, the writer has an obligation to take the history on as squarely as possible, or the story will lose what is sometimes called the ring of truth. And now she says something kind of Tolkien-esque here. For what it's worth, the same thing applies to all forms of fiction, at least from my point of view. Finally, Strange Horizons interview says, when researching your historical horror novels, where or when do you find that popular imagination most conflicts with your research? This is the trope issue, right? Have you seen a shift of fashion in which historical place readers tend to find interesting or publishers like publishing? So here's what she says. Usually, I find that a TV series or film about a given period tends to color the general understanding of most readers, such as the series The Borgias, which takes a lot of liberties with the period and the people. And she gives some examples. And don't get me started on the Tudors. It's hard to say what influence these trends in TV and film have on publishing due to the publishing lag, which tends to run 18 months to 2 years behind the public interest. That lag, by the way, is the primary reason not to chase the market, since it's already slow. If it were possible to know which period, culture, society would take the interest of publishing, writing historically based fiction would be a much stronger genre than it is. So 2 important points there, right? There is kind of a disconnect, and nobody really knows what people are going to be interested in, but people do get crazy ideas from watching movies, TV, tropes, not just about horror, but about what particular time periods were like. And, this is probably more of a problem now, given that there's so much investment in period pieces, and people just seem to love them and lap them up. So she also talks, and this is the last topic that we're going to look at from interviews, about other art forms. So Strange Horizons interview asks, how has your exposure to art influenced the way you write? Do you consider maps and other images part of your work in a story? And she says, well, my mother taught art and painted too. I was exposed to it before I could read at age 4, and it was part of my growing up. The same thing with cartography. My father was a cartographer, and I worked for him for 7 years. So my use of art and cartography are an automatic response from me. I often make maps of the settings of what I'm working on, even if it's just a matter of a few blocks, just to orient myself. I have a great many reference works on things like clothing, domestic decoration, transportation vehicles, saddlery and tack, boats and ships, automobiles, planes, farming and livestock husbandry, medicine, education, military structure and equipment, entertainment, dance, music and musical instruments, ceremonies, and almost everything else that could be part of daily life in the period of a story. Science Fiction Fantasy World says, you also have to tell us a bit about the fact that you do draft your own maps for books. How do you go about doing that, and do you make revisions? So she says, well, my family business was cartography, and I find it useful to know where I am in a story. Most of the time I'm dealing with actual places like Florence, Italy, Asia, Western Europe, and seek out as much material contemporary to the setting of the story as I can find, and then I get out my ruled drafting paper and drafting pens and go to work. On those rare occasions when I'm dealing with imaginary places, I work out the geography and the environment and then lay out the places of the story. Little Red Reviewer switches topic here. Have you found any similarities between writing music and writing fiction? So she says, there are many things that cannot be said with words, and it seems that, to me, that's where music comes in. When I get worded out, I do music to deal with the things the words cannot express. Words and music are powerful communicators, but they communicate different kinds of things. So while composition and writing are at the opposite end of the communication scale, they serve the same basic purpose. At least that's my opinion. And finally, Open Book Society interview says, I've read that you have musical training. What have you trained in, and has that influenced your books at all? And she says, well, studied music since I was 6. The main thing I do with it is compose. A fair number of my social friends are musicians. From time to time, I hang out with an opera singer who's a friend. The late Randall Baer liked my music, bless his buttons, though my manner of notation occasionally vexed him. Of course, it seeps into my writing, into things like pacing, internal rhythm, and musical references. So one of the central themes that we definitely need to talk about as we're exploring these works is that of sexuality and the role that it plays in it, sort of like when we're talking about the power before that can be used or oriented towards good in myriad ways or oriented towards evil in myriad ways, it is God or Satan. Sexuality in these volumes covers it in a very wide gamut and can be used for all sorts of purposes. And what we see are there are many people who are vulnerable sexually to being, abused, raped, exploited, forced into situations that they wouldn't take on themselves, often because of social structures. And, that's particularly there in Blood Games, but it's also there in the other ones as well. And I think what we want to talk about here is the contrast between what some of the evil characters are engaged in and forcing on others, typically on women in this, but also on men, and what it is that Saint-Germain offers instead, and, does so in a way that isn't just him on high offering it to these women who are like, oh, thank you, Saint-Germain, you're so wonderful, but treats them with a kind of equality that, in fact, elevates them and allows them agency on their own. So there's a number of passages that I've picked out that we'll look at shortly. But I do want to say this before we get into that discussion. So, in reading these books, I was like, man, there's a lot of sex involved here. But they're not written in pornographic ways. The emphasis is not just on titillating. It does really serve the story. And it's not only part of the plot, but also part of, we could call it the setting, the backdrop of the times, right? Because people are in every era finding ways to have and oftentimes enjoy sex with each other, right? It's part of the human condition, kind of necessary in order to have a human condition in any sense of continuing the human race. And it was interesting, a little bit earlier we saw that one of the interviewers talked about Saint-Germain as being a romantic hero, and Chelsea Quinn Yarbro said, well, that's not really the case. And what they might have had in mind is a hero like that of romance novels, that genre fiction. And, there's we could think of it as like overlapping circles like in a Venn diagram. What Chelsea Quinn Yarbro is not just genre fiction romance, which is a kind of, formulaic thing over here, But there is a coincidence there, isn't there? So let's look at a few of the expressions of sexuality in this. And I want to bring up what's going on with Saint Sebastian, the leader of the satanic cult. There is a character who is, Saint-Germain is connected with, Lucien. She is married to Achille Cressy, who is himself, oriented just to men, not really a fit husband for her, but he turns her over to this set that he belongs to so that they can abuse her. When she opened her eyes, she thought for a moment her terror had been ill-founded and she'd been taken to a physician for help. She was lying flat on a table. There was a crucifix suspended over her head. Cowled figures stood about her. She was about to speak to offer thanks for her rescue when she realized she was still naked and the crucifix was inverted. Even as she saw this blasphemy, she looked at the corpus more clearly, seeing the obscenity that had been made of the body of Christ. The erect phallus was as long as the torso of the figure, and a pentacle was engraved on the forehead. And Saint Sebastian says, "Excellent, excellent. She is conscious, so much the better." And he says, "You may use her as you will until 3 o'clock. Once I have done with her, I will take her maidenhead and will use her again just as the hour strikes. Keep that in mind. First and last, she is mine. Employ your lusts on her and on each other, but her virginity is mine." And then he, is talking about tying her down and says, "Put the devil's member near at hand. I will need it at 3 o'clock. Be sure it is hot enough." So this is to abuse and in some respects obliterate the victim. And you can think of Saint Sebastian as kind of like a stand-in for a later figure, the Marquis de Sade, but there were probably other people like that as well. Later on in the work, we see that Madeline has been captured, and her father tries to free her, gets captured as well, ends up being abused and raped by Achille, the person we just talked about before. Madeline has already been abused to some degree, and they're carrying out this ritual, and they say, "We bring him," Satan, "sacrifices, lives paid in blood, in degradation," right? And she feels herself almost overcome with fear and wretchedness. She knew for her the heinous men had not even begun to do what they were capable of doing. She remembered there would be 40 days for her destruction. Torture, rape, all of these sorts of things is what they're about. And so you get a particularly debased sort of sexuality oriented towards exploitation, domination. And, we see something very similar to that in Blood Games with how Olivia is treated by her husband. He brings in gladiators, all sorts of other people, low-born slaves, has them force themselves on her, and he stands by to watch, and that's how he actually gets himself aroused and gets himself off. And she is talking to Saint-Germain, and she says, he asks her, "How long have you lived this way, Olivia?" And she says, "At first it didn't happen very often. He would tell me to ask this man or that to sleep with me. They weren't men I would have wanted to ask. I thought it would stop or I would get used to it, but Justice never comes to my bed unless someone else does it first. He says it is necessary for him. I'm afraid to try to show him otherwise. He wants to see," now this is really important, "the act done without affection or tenderness or any pleasure but his. Tonight was the first time he helped. He held me for his bodyguard." And so this is over years and years. This is what she is being subjected to by her husband, the Roman senator, who holds a lot of power in the story. We should go on, and there's, discussions that are going on in this. He tells her, if we lie together 5 or 6 more times, then, you will change. "I will be your ally," he says, "if you like, and ask nothing more of you, but I will not abandon you to your husband." And then he says to himself, he had seen more beautiful women, he thought as he spoke to her. He had slept beside them or visited them as a dream, and he had left them sated but hungry. With Olivia, he could feast on the light in her eyes. This was not the strength of the bond holding him to her. It was not even his need. Olivia herself, her unique self, was the tie, and it would have been even if he had never touched her. So we have contrast, an attempt to, victimize, and a kind of intimacy and reverentiality towards the other, and everything in between in sexuality is possible. And we get other characters who have sex in other ways that are, not quite so dramatic as either of these. Tishtri, the Armenian charioteer, takes the men that she wants, even though she is also a vampire and has been with him. And we see an interesting discussion that ties these two together with Olivia. And he says, there are things you must know and a few things you and I must accept. Before you go to your tomb and walk again, you may want a man again. You may deny that now. Not all men are like justice. There are those who will fire your blood, and you'll be drawn to them. When the bitterness and hatred have faded, you will be drawn to them as you should be. Understand that, my love. You should desire others and seek them. It is our life. But tonight, it is only between us. Anxiety made her voice high and small. So we've got this contrast here. Saint-Germain knows that there will, if you're spreading out your life and your loves over time, there will be multiple loves. There will be multiple relationships. And he's sort of giving that not just as this is what's coming up, but a blessing. And she says, I just want you tonight. That is what we have. And he says, all night, we will do whatever you wish. Do you want me to caress you and embrace you until you have a release of your own accord? That is your right, and you may ask it of me. Do you want me to search for new expressions of love? You have only to tell me, and it will be as you wish. You've been ordered too long. Be abundantly selfish, Olivia, and you will be more generous to me than you know. And she says, but is this mine, or is this something else foreign to me? She'd wondered this from the first time he'd come to her, giving her pleasure when she'd expected the worst brutality. Foreign, he laughed, though there was melancholy in the dark eyes. Do you think that this is any more foreign than what you have been subjected to? Is what your husband forces on you more human because there is semen on the sheets at the end of it? Centuries ago, that question would have angered him, but he had answered it many times, and the distaste it once engendered in him was gone. Now it was only a matter of reassuring Olivia so she could set her anguish, her doubt, and worry aside. Now, what is the reference here? Saint-Germain doesn't have sex penetratively, right? That's not something that's possible for vampires after a while. At first it is, and then it doesn't happen. But pleasure is something that can be given and received and shared in all sorts of different ways. Now, that's going to get him in trouble in the second book with this character, Astasia, right, who actually threatens to go to the church. They are really inquisitive at that time under Savonarola, and they're going to break up. And she tells him, if you're not a eunuch, if you'll enter my body like a man, and then I won't confess. She smiled nastily at him, and he says, listen to me, Bella mia. I've lived in more places than you know of in this world. I would dislike having to leave Fiorenza, but rather than be coerced by you, I would, And so she's trying to use threats against him to get him to have the kind of sex with her that she desires. And she will later, in a religious mania, go crazy and accuse him. So we find there's two scenes in particular. Astasia, she's talking to a sister, and she says, I have had a great many lovers, some of them very rich, some of them very beautiful men. They were all intoxicated with me. They made themselves drunk with my body. Only I could satisfy them. Don't you ever wish in the dark of the night when you lie alone on your bed that you had a lover who would so possess you, you were yourself no longer? And here we have a different picture of sexuality, right? Neither that of Saint-Germain, this sharing or anything like that. It is something ravenous, it is something controlling, but it's not the diabolical controlling of Saint Sebastian or even Justice or people like that. But it's going to go wrong very, very quickly. And Astasia says, what do I care, so long as I'm damned, so long as devils in hell cannot resist me? If lust is a sin in heaven, it must be a virtue in hell. And so she's going through these fits, and then eventually she engages in a false confession, a very, what should we say, very vivid, lurid one. And she says that, this is in a text of the confession of Donna Astasia Caterina dell'Arrigo della Cittadella de Parma, made to Savonarola and published in Fiorenza. So I'm going to just give you some excerpts. For many months I've been visited by devils, and they've led me to great wrongs. It's the fault of my flesh, which is too easily roused, which I've vowed to master with fasting and scourges. I have made my body the house of sin, and men have wallowed there. In my vanity I've been happy to be beautiful, desirable, a woman to be looked at with lust in the heart. Right? And she goes on and says, all but one of my lovers have confessed and repented their debauchery, and for that reason they should not be shamed by me. The 5 men who've made peace with God are forgiven in heaven and will sin no more. And theirs were sins common to all of you, the bestial ruttings of animals sating themselves in their passions on my body. The other lover, whether he was a devil or a man, I cannot say. He was a foreigner. And so she's confessing about Saint-Germain. And he says, or she says, I could not fight his will. He chose a night when Sandro and Simone were away and forced his way into the house. I tried to defend myself against him. He prevailed and at last bound me to my own bed. He was of enormous proportions, and he tore my body with his virile member, which he thrust into me mercilessly, spending his seeds many times that night. He beat me cruelly with whips of silk, and he forced me to anoint his member with holy oil before he used me with unnatural brutality. But this was not enough for him. And this is all false, right? Because Saint-Germain doesn't have penetrative sex. He came again to my bed and ravished me in ways I dare not describe. Say that sinful men sometimes use boys as he used me. He then told me his seed would not fill me with child, but with devils, right? And she says, I hope to be rid of his passion, but the devils he'd put into my body gagged me and cursed me with such torture. And then, she goes on and says, it maddened him when I pleaded with him to kill me, but to spare the sacred objects and building from this depraved, profane love. He silenced me by renewed violations of my body, laughing when I could not keep from screaming. And so, what has gone wrong? She's gone insane, partly through her desires, partly through losing Saint-Germain, partly through deciding that if she can't have him, nobody will have him, partly through religious mania fostered by Savonarola and the entire culture, that's kind of around her. So we get to see some very interesting pictures, very different from each other, of this entire gamut of sexuality. And as I mentioned, it's not just part of the plot. People having sex with each other, arouses certain things, makes people vulnerable to each other. It's also part of the very setting itself. And it's integral to these stories, and something possible, something good, a kind of intimacy, is being presented here. And so that's a pretty important philosophical theme. Lest we go on interminably and extend this way past the projected time, we've got to start to wrap this video up. And there is one other major philosophical theme that I definitely want to discuss with respect to these Saint-Germain novels. And that is, well, what do you do with eternity or something like it? And this is a big problem. You know, when we picture things like hell or heaven or any sort of immortality, we've got this question, well, what do you do all day? How do you fill up that time? And since human beings do exist in relation to each other, what do you do when you outlive everybody? And this is, a problem for vampires, this is a problem for angels, this is a problem for the Highlander, pick whoever you want, right? How do you fill up that time without succumbing to passions, doing things just to feel alive, falling into despair, into loneliness? And Saint-Germain actually seems to have kind of an answer worked out for this and to represent it and to, in some ways, even teach other people who become vampires how they could live that sort of life. We saw him talking about that with some of the other characters before. And what is the answer? Well, it's connection. It's a refusal to simply withdraw. It's a willingness to take on projects like, building a palace or saving people who need saving and destroying a wicked satanic cult in, Hotel Transylvania. But it's not just having like a big project, it's also the people that you're involved with. And this is, as we pointed out, an issue in many speculative fiction matters. So long as there's something like immortality, the relation between the immortals and mortals is an open question. You don't want to get too attached, right? Typically, because they're going to die soon. They're ephemeral. The word there means the thing of a day. Insects like mayflies who live just for a brief period. That's the way human beings could appear to be to immortals. But it's also possible, this is where we get the humanism involved that Yarbro talked about earlier in some of those interviews. It's possible to say, I embrace humanity, not the evil, wicked, depraved parts of it necessarily, which probably need to be called out and resisted, but what human beings are capable of despite their seemingly short lifespans. In a way, you could say that the immortal is stuck living in a world that is a thoroughly humanized world. I mean, they can withdraw out to the wilderness and be there with the weather and plants and beasts, but there's something that is unsatisfactory about that and can't really hold them for that long. We find Saint-Germain in cities, in places where other human beings are caring about their daily business or their grand plans or trying to create their own legacies or engaging in projects like that of, study and alchemy that, seem to be holding out, prospects for something bigger, more lasting than themselves. So this is a really interesting theme. The answer to the problem of immortality would be to find enough, and not just sheer variety, but things that you can, we'll make a pun here, sink your teeth into, right? Not in the vampire way, but in the sense of being interested in and understanding the facets. And if you could do that, then eternity could be bearable, even enjoyable. But if you can't do that, if you're locked in yourself, it would really be a hell, and you would want the true death. So that is where we're going to wrap up our study of the first 3 books of this very interesting and long-lived series centered around this character, Saint-Germain, these novels by Quinn Yarbro, great horror author among other genres. And so we'll wrap it up here. If you're watching this during the premiere, we're going to have a conference using Zoom shortly after this. Otherwise, you can leave your comments, questions, whatever it is that you want to say in the comments section, and join us for further Worlds of Speculative Fiction series sessions. We do these monthly, usually second Saturday of the month. We're happy for you to join, and you can look over the many other videos in the series. This is number 80 that we're finishing up here.